Hello, students. Today I'd like to begin a discussion about the geography of the New Testament, an attempt for us to kind of have a sense of the actual on-the-ground areas in which the gospel activity and then Paul's activities took place. So I'm going to lead you through a series of maps and try to at least enhance our understanding a bit of the geographical background in which the activity of the New Testament takes place. I want to begin by talking about the larger idea, the larger political, social structure which impacts the geography of the New Testament. And that is that this is a period of time in which Rome was dominant. The Roman Empire controlled the entire region around the Mediterranean Sea. Certainly, they took over already a fairly large kingdom that had been developed by Alexander the Great in 332 BC. But Rome expanded it even more, especially up into Europe, and in such a way that the entire Mediterranean area was Rome. They controlled the shipping lanes, which was the primary means by which cargo and people were transmitted around there. But they also developed road systems that made travel quite dominant. And so we can imagine that the entire region of the Mediterranean was somewhat unified. It's not at all insignificant that we would call this the Roman Empire. This map that I have here shows the red outlines of the control of the Roman Empire. And you can see it's pretty well the entire Mediterranean region. Certainly, it includes the areas that are important to us, and here in this next map I have some highlighted areas. Highlighted area number one is Palestine, Israel, that is where the Gospels take place. Fairly small, insignificant little region when you think about it. The number two is Asia Minor, which is going to be a great significant area of Paul's activity. And number three is Greece, which is also a major area of Paul's activity. And so these three together probably are the major foci of the New Testament activity, and we'll turn to those a bit more in detail in a bit. So let's first begin by looking at the Judean context. The Gospels are all focused in the area that we would call Israel, that is now comprised of Galilee to the north and Judea to the south, and in between is Samaria. Some issues that we want to take a look at are the way in which terrain and climate might have influenced some of the activity there, but then also to turn to some political issues. In particular, we want to look at Herod the Great's political structure, and then followed by his sons, which are really dominant during the Gospel period, and a little bit of the terrain of Galilee. So let's turn to these in turn. Here's a quick oversight of this larger region. And notice that to the north is Galilee here. And the little map here says Tetrarchy of Herod Antipas, which shows that it's both Galilee and in the Transjordan area, Perea. And below that is a region of Samaria, and below that is Judea and Idumea. These are going to be the main areas that we're talking about when talking about the gospel activity. Before we actually go back to some political and a bit more discussion of the region, it's useful to realize just how significant the geographical, topographical construction here is. This area is dominated by a major rift valley. Notice that the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, and the Sea of Galilee that are all connected here are in the middle of a valley, quite a significant rift valley. The Dead Sea and the Jordan River are below sea level, significantly below sea level. Water flows down from the mountains way up in the north there where Dan is, flows into the Sea of Galilee, flows down into the Jordan River, into the Dead Sea, and then it doesn't go any farther because the Dead Sea is the lowest location point there. And of course, because it's receiving water and never giving any of it out, and it collects excess salt, and that's the reason why it's a Dead Sea. On each side of this low rift valley, notice that there's some significant mountain ranges on each side. So over on the eastern side, that there is the Transjordan Mountains here, that are the areas where Moses looked out over the Promised Land. And on the western side is the main mountain range, in which Jerusalem is actually in one of the high points there, in the middle of this mountain range. And the mountain range continues almost all the way through the lower areas of Judah and Samaria, broken only by the Jezreel Valley, and then to the north the mountains pick up again in Upper Galilee. So these, to a great extent, the activity is in kind of mountainous regions, except down in the Rift Valley along the Jordan River, and it's a pretty significant elevation climb between the Jordan River up to Jerusalem. So there's quite hilly terrain in that whole area. Well, let's turn a little bit more now to some of this political issue. When Herod the Great is king, he expanded the kingdom to perhaps the greatest extent since King Solomon in the Old Testament time. And you can see here that when Herod took over, it was the darker green outline. He expanded it to include the lighter green outline. Notice significant is the area up in the northeast, which is the area of Ituraea, Gaulonitis, Trachonitis. He really expanded that well into parts of Syria. So when he died, he left a fairly extensive kingdom area under his control. Now, of course, Rome was really the dominant power, but Herod was a client king who was allowed to rule this area with quite a bit of independence, as long as he kept on the right side of Rome. When he died, the kingdom was split up into three different segments. The lower area here in the southwestern area, you'll see Samaria, Judea, and Idumea. Those together were controlled by Archelaus, one of the sons of Herod. The darker green area here, particularly Galilee, Decapolis, and Perea, were controlled by Herod Antipas, who is the primary Herod we read about in the Gospels when Jesus is talking. And the yellow is Philip, and he's Herod Philip. We don't hear much about him in the Gospels. We hear almost nothing about Archelaus either, because in 6 A.D., the Romans essentially removed Archelaus as ruler of Samaria and Judea, sent him packing to Gaul, modern France, and instead installed their own governor. And by the time of Jesus, that governor was Pilate, a well-known person. He essentially kind of was the procurator, the governor of this region. With good reason, by the way. Archelaus was kind of crazy, and he was causing more problems than worth, and so the Romans really moved rather quickly to get rid of him. Herod Antipas is the ruler in Galilee, and of course, at least in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke, most of the activity of Jesus is in Galilee. In the case of John, much of it is in Jerusalem, which is in Judea. We don't hear much about Philip, except to say that Herod Antipas married Philip's wife, which is the reason why John the Baptist was killed. John the Baptist criticized Herod Antipas for marrying his brother's wife, and as a result was executed. But that's about all we ever hear much about Philip. One other thing before we leave here, this map, and that is with Pilate down in ruling the southern region of Judea, and Herod Antipas ruling the northern region of Galilee, it was pretty clear that there was tension and struggles between these two areas. And so we should not imagine that all was happy between these various kings or rulers. They were jealous for their area and really wanted to control more of it. Herod Antipas always thought that he should control that whole area, and so he was really not happy with Pilate being in the south. Here we have a bit more of a narrow focus of Galilee. Notice at the top end of the Sea of Galilee here are some cities that you'll recognize well. Capernaum, Bethsaida. These are areas of significant activity of Jesus. In fact, we could say that both of these are kind of the home base of Jesus. If you move over to the western side, up into the mountain regions, you'll notice some of those little pin dots, or especially blue pin dots. There's one for Cana. Of course, we know about that from the Gospel of John. And Nazareth, where Jesus was born and raised, or raised at least. And so this whole area, kind of the mountain regions where he grew up, and then the region around the Sea of Galilee itself, all of these are kind of the primary region of activity of Jesus as he kind of moved through this kind of somewhat moderate hill region of Upper and Lower Galilee. One other thing, too, let me point out, way up in the northern part of here, there's a blue pin dot that is Caesarea Philippi. This is actually the farthest north that Jesus ever goes. In fact, it's here that Jesus asked Peter, "Who people say that I am?" And Peter replies, "You're the Christ." This is kind of at the uppermost region of his travels, and from here on he moves back towards Jerusalem and ultimately to his death. All right, well, let's turn here now from the Judea, from the Israel region to the larger area of Paul's journeys. Paul's primary activity ultimately is in Asia Minor and in Greece. Paul himself was born in Asia Minor, in Tarsus, and his younger adult period was spent in Judea around Jerusalem, where he was trained as a Pharisee. But after he became a Christian, his primary focus ended up being evangelism across larger regions of the empire. So again, to remind us of the region here, we have Asia Minor to the northeast here, and then Greece and Italy. All of this is going to be much of the focus of Paul's activity. So we'll start with the kind of the snapshot of Asia Minor at the time, and this map is really helpful because it places a number of region names that you're going to run across in Acts. Places like Galatia and Cilicia and Pamphylia and Asia. Notice that Asia here is a region of Asia Minor. It's the area around Ephesus, and then way to the north, Bithynia, Pontus, Paphlagonia. These are areas that we hear about in 1 Peter, where Peter writes to those regions. We don't know how they were ever evangelized, but they come into focus there. Turning from that, we'll turn to the area of Greece. In the northern part of this area of Greece, notice that the cities of Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea, which were early evangelized focus of Paul, and of course he writes letters to Philippi, the letter of Philippians, and to Thessalonica, the letter of Thessalonians. And then he travels south, and we get down to the area in Achaia of Athens and Corinth. Corinth is on this very thin isthmus that connects the lower area of Achaia from the northern area, and is a major transfer site for shipping. We'll talk a little bit about that. Notice at the very bottom of this map is Crete. Crete we'll hear about, where Paul writes to Titus. Titus is on the island of Crete when he writes to him. To give you an idea of how these all connect in Paul's journeys, and we'll come back to this when we do the book of Acts, but just to give you a little bit of a sense, he has 3 different journeys, missionary journeys, and they all start and stop in Antioch. Antioch is there in that region of Syria. If you'll see at on the upper right-hand side. That's where Paul settled into that church after he became a Christian. He met Barnabas there. And then together they begin the first journey together. Notice that they moved from Antioch over to the island of Cyprus and then ultimately up to the mainland of Pisidia, and then up to these 4 cities that they created churches in: Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And then they return. And that's the first missionary journey. The second missionary journey begins again at Antioch. And this time he returns through some of the churches that he had evangelized early on. Notice here Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. But then he jumps all the way over to Troas, which is the site of ancient Troy, the Trojan War location. And part of that is that in the book of Acts it says he tried to go up north to Bithynia, but was resisted by the Holy Spirit, whatever that means. And so he ends up at Troas, and then he has a vision of a person inviting him to come over to Europe, and so he jumps over the Hellespont and lands in Neapolis, and ultimately settles in at Philippi and then at Thessalonica and Berea, where he founds churches. And then down to Athens, and then to Corinth, where he creates another significant church. And then to Ephesus, where a church had already been started. He spends a little time there, but we'll come back to him on the third journey. Then he returns to Caesarea, Jerusalem, and then ultimately back home to Antioch. The third journey starts again at Antioch, and this time he goes rather directly to Ephesus, where he spends approximately 3 years. And becomes kind of a focus of quite a bit of activity. And then he makes a kind of a final farewell journey through various churches that he'd already created, that is at Corinth and Thessalonica and Philippi, and then ultimately travels in a sea journey back to Caesarea and Jerusalem, where he's arrested, and ultimately sent to Rome for the end of his life. So notice the rather significant regions here of Asia and Greece that comprise the focus of Paul's activity. I want to do one more map here of Asia Minor, and that is just to note that this is also the activity in which John's letters to the churches in the opening chapters of Revelation take place. So he writes to these various churches, that some of which we've heard about already from Paul. Paul, of course, was in Ephesus. He writes to Colossae. That's the letter of Colossians. In that letter, he makes reference to a letter he sent to Laodicea, and these other significant cities around here, Pergamum, Smyrna, actually, and some of them are quite significant cities. Pergamum especially. These are the areas in which John writes his various letters in the book of Revelation. So again, this becomes part of our geographical reference as well. And that's pretty much the geographical focus. This is something hopefully you'll kind of stick in your mind and remember the significant areas. I'll close you here with this picture of the Zeus temple in Pergamum. Pergamum is one of those cities that is referenced in the book of Revelation, and this temple was moved block by block from Pergamum and now sits in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, and is a massive temple. Notice all the friezes, of which not all of it was able to be reconstructed. Some of it had been damaged over time. But the friezes, all of which depict battles between various gods in the Greek pantheon. Well, that's my lecture on geography. I hope you find that helpful. We'll turn to some historical issues next. Thank you.